Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss whether the captains of industry in Britain have been blind about the impact of Brexit, in which case they are incompetent, or they fail to properly engage with it for whatever reasons and are now just looking for excuses. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I talked recently about the way in which poultry production has been hit in Britain. A number of factors which have impacted the industry. I suppose three big ones would be Brexit, of course, obvious. We have cut off access to a huge number of workers who had been powering the industry, and so now there are shortages. An average of 16% unfilled vacancies is what's been reported industry-wide. Brexit has also seriously impacted their capacity to export to the EU, but I'm focusing on domestic food production here. And the impact is a direct result of our government. They don't get to blame the Brexit referendum for this one. They don't get to blame the EU. They campaigned for the Brexit referendum anyway, the current lot in charge. It was their extreme Tory Brexit, which was not the Tory Brexit promised in 2016, that is responsible for this. The second impact is, of course, the coronavirus pandemic, specifically infections. In the middle of a pandemic, people become ill and will have to be off work. Staff illness will, in most years, be fairly predictable, and you manage your staffing levels to take account of this. But what has thrown things completely out of kilter has been the sheer number of infections. Our government decided to go for a containment strategy with COVID as opposed to the zero COVID strategy adopted by advanced Pacific nations, who are doing rather well. The end result is a huge number of illnesses, resulting in a higher than expected number of staff absences. This is again down to policy decisions. Now, you could argue that we are not alone in Europe in this act of folly, but we still decided our own strategy. We don't get to blame our neighbours. We didn't have to copy Europe. We could have copied Asia. We didn't. This is the price. And the third impact is the so-called pingdemic. Having staff isolated, many of whom won't be ill because they've been in contact with someone who had tested positive. The fault here is not the app, but the high number of infections. Responsibility here, you could argue, is shared. It is primarily the government's fault for adopting an unrealistic strategy of containing the spread of the infection, which they failed to do so. But some workplaces may also have not done enough to protect their workers. And it potentially stands to reason that you could suppose that the workplaces worst affected by the pandemic are more likely, not certain, but more likely to have been those who did not implement effective mitigation. But the pandemic is over. The governments say that their contribution to staff shortages is to change the rules so that fully vaccinated workers don't have to isolate as a result of contact with the infected. Well, that's it, by the way, nothing else. They don't have any further plans to help. That was it. So a mixture of an extreme Brexit and an extreme pandemic has rendered some businesses woefully short of staff. But did business leaders do enough to prepare for the damage? Granted, there's always going to be a limit to what you can do to prepare for a calamity like this, but it's a bit like the question of Raab and the phone call he wouldn't make. It's less about what good it would have done and more about the attempt to at least try, or lack thereof. So in a local Essex media outlet, I saw someone link, there's a report of a huge business leader within the poultry industry, Ranjit Singh Baparan, citing both Brexit and COVID as a problem for his businesses, where he's experienced, he says, 15% vacancies, which is similar to the industry average. He was warning the government that if they didn't act, that we would be facing the most serious food shortages this country had seen in over 75 years. Nice one. Back to rationing then. Okay. But he was also reported as saying, and I quote, "No one could possibly have predicted this toxic cocktail would come together at this time." No one? Quite a few people were talking about the pressures that a hard Brexit would force on the supply chain years ago. Last year, they were also warning about how COVID would add further pressure as well. We haven't even seen the worst of it yet. How can a man who runs a business which employs 23,000 people say that they didn't know in 2020 how Brexit and COVID were going to affect his business in 2021? Now let's look at how he breaks it down. 1, for Brexit, he points to being cut off from the large pool of workers that he previously had access to. Didn't he know that this was going to happen? Why didn't he know? I knew. He could have employed me to clue him in. He'd have actually done better to employ a trade expert. I'm sure such a large business could afford to hire expert consultants to prepare for the biggest change to their market for generations. He simply cannot tell me that he thought he'd still be able to access EU workers after we left the single market when it was clear which way the government was going. They were already publishing their immigration policy long ahead of when it was being implemented. In this regard, at least, throughout the last year, we knew exactly where this was going. We knew that that market was going to be cut off. Secondly, he talks about COVID. Now, when it comes to COVID, again, how could he not realise how a global pandemic was going to affect his business this year? He wouldn't have been able to expect that the pandemic would fade away in 2021. That's what he thought. Throughout most of 2020, we didn't even know if vaccines would be possible, much less how quickly we could roll them out. Even at the end of 2020, when there was more optimism, anyone listening to experts knew that this wasn't a silver bullet and that 2021 was still going to be tough. But even if you suppose that he was not listening to the experts, and again, I'll say that such a large business should be hiring consultants to provide them with expert analysis on how any threat to their business is likely to affect them. They should have hired a trade expert to discuss Brexit. They should have hired a scientific expert to advise them about COVID as well. No excuse for ignorance with such a large and profitable company. A small business owner, fair enough, they have to do their own research as well as run their own business, understandable, but not one of this magnitude. But anyway, even if you suppose that they got their COVID information from the Daily Express, you'd be reading about vaccine optimism at a time when Brexit was about to bite and the pandemic already was. They should have already had the measures needed to cope with both that would still be useful now. Again, only so much you could do, fair enough, only so much you could do. If there aren't enough workers in Britain to compensate for the loss of EU workers, you can't just clone new ones. But a company facing up to these challenges openly could have worked more quickly on attracting what few workers would be available before they went to work elsewhere. They could and should have realised that a worker shortage, a severe worker shortage, would mean needing to pay more and offer better working conditions. They should have had these in place in advance to make the best of this extreme Tory Brexit. Instead, we hear him telling MPs that nobody could have predicted what actual experts were predicting sometime in advance of this mess we're in now. And can we trust such a man, who apparently had no idea how Brexit and COVID would hamper his business, to know anything about his own industry? But if we assume that he's not completely ignorant, then we can consider his statement that without intervention from the government, this country is going to see severe food shortages. Not just more gaps on the shelves and higher prices for what's left, which I already worry about how that's devastating for the millions in food poverty in this country, as well as all those who will be joining that unenviable club as a result, the ones who used to just about manage, as Theresa May would say. But shortages so severe that perhaps even the voting middle classes will start to see privations. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Surely the government do not want to allow that to happen. Surely they will have to act to prevent what would be huge electoral damage for them. But then, if a large employer didn't know how either Brexit or COVID was going to affect their massive business, perhaps the even more clueless ministers who run our government are similarly blind to the consequences of their dangerous policies as well. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.